Welcome to another episode of loop&life, where we dive into breaking news, share our unfiltered hot takes, and discuss all things related to diabetes technology. Brought to you by DCB, the Swiss non-profit powerhouse, where we spot unmet needs in diabetes tech and translate bold ideas into real solutions out there, helping people with diabetes worldwide.
Well, Greta, traveling as a person with diabetes is an organizational challenge. How do you manage your traveling?
As you probably know, I do like traveling. I do it a lot. And I know there's loads of talk about managing jet lags, managing food that's different depending on what food you're used to and where you go. But honestly, the biggest challenge to me has been the process of packing everything, and my friends, they go on like a 5-day trip to Spain and they're overwhelmed on what clothes to bring. And I have this entire mental list of like, okay, infusion sets, spare infusion sets, insulin, reservoirs. What if the pump completely fails? Then I need pens. I need needles for my pen. I need a charging cable for my pump with an adapter to charge my pump. I need gummy bears because maybe I'm in a hypo and I don't have access to a supermarket. And that's just the beginning of the list. And then there's all these things to think about and to remember what to bring. And I think what I underestimated the most is how much space it takes. I remember going on a 2-month backpacking trip when I was on a pump. And I don't like traveling with a lot of stuff because if you go somewhere where it's warm, you don't need that many different kinds of clothes. So I had my, pile of clothes, and then I had my pile of diabetes supplies.
Yeah.
And I think that was the first time when I realized, wow, it's actually a lot of stuff to bring, and you can't even have it in your checked luggage. Or at least you shouldn't. I don't have it in my checked luggage if I travel.
Never. Yeah.
And that for me, I think I remember sitting there with my tiny backpack and my mountain of supplies. And I was like, traveling lightly is maybe not that easy when you have type 1.
Can you imagine? Also, security probably had a close look at all the stuff you had with you, right? At the airport.
Yeah, even though I do believe that it's more and more common.
Yeah.
So depending on where you go, they don't really question it as much anymore. Happens to me more often that they're like, oh, you have a sensor in your arm, and they're like, oh, you're born with it, or you can't eat candy. And I'm standing there at Berlin airport at 5 a.m. I'm just like, please, no. Yes, okay, goodbye. So usually that's quite smooth. For me, the biggest challenge was everything you need to bring and everything else you need to consider when you go traveling with type 1 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it's an important topic because we work remotely, there's digital nomads. Our life is a lot more, international or on the run compared to maybe 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, when I was CEO in a medtech company, I was flying something 100 to 120 flights a year. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, for one night to San Francisco, just for one meeting. That was before Corona. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And all these different time zones and sometimes waking up in the morning not really knowing where you are, in which city you are. And that actually made me that I had some really standardized processes. Mm-hmm. It's really funny. So whenever I arrive at an airport, the first thing I do is I go and buy a bottle of Coke. Regular Coke. Mm-hmm. Because I always know, when you fly for a long time and you sit there and you don't move for 8, 9, 10 hours, yeah, and then you get something to eat, and you need a lot of insulin to manage that carbohydrates which you have, and then you go off the plane, and then you start running around. You run
trying to catch your connecting flight at JFK.
Exactly, or getting your luggage and then to the train and into the city and so on, mm-hmm. And then suddenly your insulin really kicks in, yeah, and then you go low. And that's why the first thing I do is I buy a bottle of Coke to have a little bit of extra sugar with me, just to be on the safe side. It's just these standardized processes or procedures. It's really interesting.
So with all those, frequent travels, what's the hardest part or the biggest challenge for you when you travel with type 1?
Managing the time zones, especially going east. West is, I found, less of a problem, but going east was minus or plus 8, 9, 10 hours. Then really to find the right way of how to adjust your basal insulin, or at the beginning I was on MDI therapy, so I had to find the right point in time to inject my basal insulin, and that's actually when I started to inject basal insulin twice a day. Even so, they said that the basal insulin should work 24 hours. I started to inject twice a day to have this flexibility, or have a little bit more flexibility to inject my basal insulin.
So what would you say, in a nutshell, makes traveling with diabetes so special or different from traveling without?
As I said, the organization, the management, the planning. Do you have everything with you? Normally when you, as a person without diabetes, you think, okay, do I have my, enough shirts with me, enough socks with me? I don't know. Yeah. And I think for us, we are on a completely different level. We go on a weekend trip and we have to, do I have 3 glucose sensors extra? Do I have enough infusion sets? What happens if I have a delay, if my flight is delayed by 1 day or so? We have to anticipate all these challenges.
And do you have, if you look back now on 30 plus years and 20 plus, in my case, years, is there any stories that you particularly remember that either were chaos or that maybe was like an unexpected win or something?
Once I know exactly, I arrived at Logan Airport in Boston, and I had a connecting flight, so I only had a handbag with me. And when you arrive in the US, you have to go through customs, and then you go back through security to the next flight. So, and at that security, they saw that I had insulin with me. I said, yes. And they said, well, but it might be dangerous if I would attack the pilot, right? I said, in principle, yes. And then I'm not allowed to take the insulin on board. I said, not really, right? You're joking, right? So at the end, actually, they called the medical supervisor, and then the medical supervisor said, okay, let's make a deal. I said, what kind of deal are you talking? I mean, it's like,
if you're pretending I'm smuggling illegal substances, it's a life-saving medication. But
the airport security put all my insulin in a plastic bag and walked with me to the next plane, and then gave the insulin to the pilot and said, okay, once you are landed at your final destination, you can give the insulin back to Mr. Brandt. And I looked at him and said, no. The funny part was, when the door was closed, the pilot came to me and said, my son is a type 1, and gave me the insulin back. It was kind of funny.
That is, it's a good end, but what do you do on a long-haul flight if they don't let you have your insulin pen,
Don't eat.
Great.
Yeah, and another one was actually also at the security at the airport. The security guy saw that I have a glucose sensor at my arm and ripped it off.
Just without
he just wanted to see how I don't know how solid that is fixed to my arm or so. Ripped it off, so I stood there without a glucose sensor.
Oh my god!
And you need to stay calm,
Did you?
To a certain degree. Yeah. So that's 2 examples of
so you have airport checks. Incidents.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
I remember it was actually only a month ago or so. Speaking of the never-ending list of things to bring, I forgot. I didn't bring any blood glucose meter. I was traveling to Central America and I didn't bring any blood glucose meter, because usually my CGM never really fails, and if it does, I put another one. But I've had good experiences with my CGM, so I was like, I didn't even think about it. Didn't even leave it at home on purpose. It just didn't cross my mind. And then obviously what happened is that my CGM was acting up. It gave me weird readings. It was bleeding a lot. So it was all weird things combined. And I didn't have a lot of spare sensors because I extended my flight. So my spare sensor was for these extra 7 days. I was like, I cannot just rip it off and put a new one because then I'm going to be short on sensors. So the, sensible thing to do would be to calibrate it. But how do you calibrate your sensor if you didn't bring a blood glucose meter? So I went to the nearest health clinic and I said, this is the scenario. I just need a finger prick to check my blood. And they were like, yeah, we can do that under doctoral supervision. Somebody's going to prick your finger. And I was like, okay, whatever. And they're like, it's $30 and you can go see a nurse. And because it makes me really nervous if people prick my fingers, I prefer doing it myself. I paid 30 quid. I went inside, pricked my finger, put it on the meter, took a photo of the reading and went back home. It's the most expensive finger prick of my life. But my CGM was incredibly inaccurate. So I did actually change it in the end and it all turned out fine. But these are the little unexpected things when you're somewhere else and you forgot to bring something, you know.
Yeah. It's also, in a lot of countries, it's not easy to buy insulin or other devices in the pharmacy. So you need a prescription, right? And if possible, the prescription should be in English, because in most countries they can't read other languages compared to the local language and English. So you need to find a doctor who gives you the prescription in English so that you can buy insulin if needed. And so that's also kind of, you have various challenges while traveling. How do you manage the time zones? Is that a problem for you?
Not so much, actually. I think there's so much, disruption when it comes to traveling. You eat differently, you sleep differently, you have a jet lag, you run around airports and then you don't move at all. So somehow it's not that big of a problem. I think it was a bigger problem when I was still on a pump because I had quite a different basal rate for almost every hour. I never realized for me, that was never a big problem because I feel like the first day when you travel, it's always a bit up and down. And one of my hacks is that I usually just don't eat a lot on airplanes, for example. It's also unnecessary stress. You finally manage to fall asleep on the plane and then your Dexcom or your Libre or whatever sensor wakes you up. So I remember once flying from Bangkok to somewhere, and they had these huge bags of nuts in the duty free, and they had half a kilo of macadamia nuts for 15 euros or something. And here, just for comparison, if you go in Switzerland to a supermarket, you buy half a kilo of macadamias. That's not financially responsible. So that's what I did. I ate half a kilo of macadamias.
Jesus Christ.
And it was fine for my blood sugar.
Yeah, for the blood sugar, I can
My
imagine.
stomach hurts after, but that was fine. So maybe to summarize, I think whoever's listening and travels with diabetes probably has similar stories. Sometimes they have good, sometimes they have bad endings. But let's dive into why these problems happen, because I can imagine for somebody who doesn't live with diabetes, it's kind of hard to understand how hard can it be.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, you have certain human factors which influence and which causes problems. The over or underestimation of travel time and delays. How often have we been waiting in front of a gate because the flight was delayed for a couple of hours or even for a day or two, and you need to manage that. And also, if you are not a person with diabetes, people don't understand your needs. So you cannot expect from anybody at the security or in your hotel or so, when you say I need sugar now, they think it's kind of funny or something. So you should always be prepared to and have it solved for yourself. And then you have the technical issues, synchronization of devices. For example, your glucose sensor, which is directly connected to the phone, already has adjusted for the new time zone. But your insulin pump is still on your old time zone. So they might have a 6, 7, 8 hour time difference. So do they work together? What does the AID system do? So really have to find a way to synchronize even the time zones. Then you have temperature changes. Sometimes on the plane it's super cold, and then you go outside and it's 40 degrees Celsius. So you have very fast temperature changes, and these temperature changes have an influence on your glucose readings, humidity, altitude. If here in Switzerland, if you go up the mountains with a cable car, you have to be careful because your insulin pump might start to deliver insulin, on its own because of the pressure changes. And additionally, when you go and have a hike, you are very active, so you need to have a lot of gummy bears with you. In that case,
And the pressure change is actually something that can also happen on a flight.
Yeah. Sure. And it very much so depends on what kind of flight, if it's a big plane, a small plane, helicopter, whatever it is, And then you have the interaction between the different devices, which you always need to make sure that this is still the case. And, some of the devices only work if they have access to the internet. And so you have to make sure that you have data roaming in the traveling country, so that that the systems can communicate. So all these small details, small little things, are much more important for us people with diabetes compared to people without diabetes.
So are there any specific hacks or precautions that you take when you travel, for example?
Well, my daughters always laugh because in every suitcase they find gummy bears. I have them everywhere. It's just my backup because it's they are nicely packed.
Doesn't melt.
And you can also nicely dose them. And I, especially in hot climate zones, I don't like to eat these glucose tablets or something. They are so dry.
I never like to eat them.
Yeah, so that's then that's the gummy bears for me. So that's one thing. Definitely, always minimum have double the amount of insulin and devices with me that which I would normally need for that time period, just to be on the safe side. That's another thing I normally do. As I already said, buying a bottle of Coke at the final destination is also one thing I normally do. So there are some small things, and I totally agree. I never eat on the plane.
Yeah.
Even on a long distance flight, I always have, for example, restaurants outside the airport or not too far away from the airport, and my family always loves these kind of destinations because it's small little restaurants, and then I eat something 3-4 hours before the flight, and then and then I can sleep on the flight and just have hopefully a flat glucose during the flight. I think that's one of my things I normally do.
Yeah, I do that too, and I think with mentioning that to bring more stuff, that for me is sometimes probably the hardest part, because I sometimes think it's so unnecessary to bring that much extra stuff. It takes more space. You need to make sure that your insulin is cold. And I think that's a typical thing that happens. The few times where I didn't do it, something happened.
Yeah.
When you bring 5 extra sensors, then obviously they all last. They're 14 days. You can sweat and go swimming and nothing happens to the adhesive. But that one time you don't bring extra, it falls off after 2 days. Yeah. So it actually happened to me before that. I was almost out of CGMs, and then I was in the Caribbean, and a friend of mine knew someone with type 1 diabetes who gave me a spare sensor that she had. And it was a bit of a roller coaster of emotions, because at first I was super grateful, and then I realized that sensor is not available in Switzerland anymore, so I couldn't download the app for the sensor readings.
Okay, isn't it?
And that's something I've never thought about before.
Yeah. It's crazy.
So
it's funny.
better safe than sorry.
In January, I met a lady, and her child is developed type 1 diabetes, and then she decided to come up with an own app. You know, the app is called Hey Debbie. It's really nice because that app connects people with diabetes, and you can actually tell the system on what kind of devices you are and what kind of devices you have access to. Yeah, and then actually when you open the app, you see a map around you, and you see the people around you in the city, in the same city, and you can see what kind of devices they have. So if you would need extra sensors, extra infusion sets or something, you can see if there's somebody around who might be able to help you out. I found that a super smart solution. And now she has a couple of thousand users all over Europe. So whenever you travel, for example, in Europe, you have the possibility to maybe ask one or the other person if he or she has an extra for you.
It's super helpful, and I think I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can basically stack the odds in our favor, and I think that's an important point, because you can't really rely on pharmacies or healthcare systems that you're not used to providing you with the things you need.
Yeah.
And having people with diabetes around might sometimes be the most successful solution. So usually when I go somewhere, and I wanted to round this off with some sort of helpful advice for people that are maybe newly diagnosed, or people that have a partner or a friend with type 1 diabetes, I always make sure that I know how easy it is to get insulin with or without a prescription. If I go to a country that I've never been before, I'll check what's the access like. Because there's also countries, for example, where they just don't have any CGMs. So you can go to any pharmacy, but they don't have them, depending on where you go. Or you go to pharmacies and they don't give it to you unless you have a paper prescription. And I've also been in countries where I walked in, I said, I need an insulin pen, I have type 1 diabetes, and they just gave it to me. So one thing that I find quite reassuring is knowing what does the access look like in the country I travel to.
Yeah, that's very helpful to be prepared. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and again, so we can just advise you if you go especially for longer travel. Prepare yourself, have the right amount of devices with you. Plan also for backup. If you are on an AID system, for example, it's probably good that if you would still know how to handle with pens, and how to switch from an AID system back to a pen, because in some cases it is just the only solution you have available in those countries, or maybe even syringes, because not everybody and not in every country you have access to pens, and you have to be aware of that. Extra sensors, extra infusion sets, blood glucose meter with you.
Noted.
Yeah. With test strips which are still valid.
Yes.
Another story, right?
That is a different story, but that's very true.
And then so be also, that's an advice from my side. We all have digital devices nowadays. Everything is connected somehow to the internet. But also think about it. What happens if you are back to analog?
Yes.
If you don't have access to the internet, what are all these devices still working, or do I have to go back to a manual mode?
I think that would be my second point, is like, what if your phone gets stolen, or something happens to your phone? Imagine that happens, and make sure that you can still manage your diabetes if you don't have your phone or your pump. So I think that's bring extra, even though it sucks. I know I'm always not as conservative in packing extra as I should be, and it is stressful, and it will ruin your trip if you run around for 2 days trying to find a CGM sensor somewhere on a tiny island. And make sure that you can manage if your devices stop working. I think that's probably the advice that I would give to you.
Yeah. So, we would really love to hear your travel stories. So if you have something interesting, why don't you write us an email to podcast@dcburn.com. So podcast@dcburn.com. And we would be happy to see all your different stories about traveling with diabetes.
Thanks for listening today, and see you soon.
Bye-bye.